Helena Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. Very brief submission, 2 points as per my written submission: urgency in the composition or voting of select committees. But I'd also like to add something very briefly that's arisen from your deliberation, that's managing the scarce time for select committee hearing of submissions, especially the role of academics and those people from knowledge institutions. So, but very brief on each of those. First, urgency. I think it's fair to say urgency in expedited lawmaking has become an addiction at the cost of good governance and checks and balances in what is a delicate constitutional ecosystem. A constitutional ecosystem, which is a political constitution, which has a lot of checks and balances exercised through the political process. If we don't give time for that political process to do its work, we don't get the checks and balances. So urgency expedition acts like a bonfire on those checks and balances, and that really worries me. And I think we can almost take that as a given. It's the community has been quite activated by this, and I don't want to get into the pack drill of who's been using it for what and things like that. The question is, how do we break it? And so I've made the suggestions about first the suggestion of tweaking the threshold for urgency and using some different language of requiring reasons for urgency, which are, I think, I suggest detailed, sufficient, and proportionate. And along with the Speaker's ability to rule on the adequacy, which I think applies to extraordinary urgency, but would operate slightly differently if we had a slightly more elevated and precise threshold for urgency, particularly one that talks about proportionality. So it's not just a given. There has got to be something very special to a reason for urgency. That's one thing, but my hobby horse is actually post-enactment review, because I think that potentially takes away much of the political advantage of urgency and expedition, restores the cost of the lost, restores the lost public participation that would have had to happen in select committees if it had gone through the extra process, and ensures the value of the select committee scrutiny is preserved. And we saw it used with the government's consent with the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act. A number of academics made that call and it was picked up, and it was the right thing to do. The question is whether we can make that obligatory for situations where urgency has been used, where select committee scrutiny has been circumvented or been done under such time pressure that it is inadequate. So I'm a big fan of that. I think you can see the advantages of keeping the political conversations going to ensure that the government is exposed to the accountability for those legislative measures. The one postscript I'd add from the COVID-19 experience is the product of the post-enactment review needs to be enlivened back in the parliamentary and political process. Difficulty with the COVID-19 recommendations was they came out 3 months later and they just gathered dust. So my suggestion is that if you're doing this, the recommendations of the select committee can somehow come back in as if it was a second reading or something like that, so that the government has to wear the political cost of dealing with that swiftly. And the idea being that if there's really constructive select committee comment, it would be in the government's advantage to continue that vehicle through to basically pick up what would otherwise be lost. So that's my urgency suggestion. Select committee composition and voting. Here I'm trying to square the circle between, I think, the two functions of select committee, both legislative scrutiny and executive scrutiny. And as it relates to legislative scrutiny, I think we can expect relatively constructive passage of government initiatives in situations where select committees don't act as just wrecking balls for legislative initiatives to require that to be reinstated in the committee of the whole, which I don't think is in anybody's benefit. We want to foster that non-partisan constructive improvement of bills. And so that legislative scrutiny, how do we protect and preserve that? A government majority in those committees is understandable. As it relates to executive scrutiny, I think there's more scope for saying that process should be opposition-led, and a situation where you might say that those committees should have a composition which reflects the proportions of the non-executive members of the House. So that's my proposition, that the two have different needs for different sort of compositions. The capacity in a small House with very few MPs means we can't have separate committees for those both of those things, which I think is the practice in some overseas jurisdiction. I'm not a comparativist on this, but that's that's how it's been dealt with elsewhere. But I've raised the question of whether we can actually square that circle with allowing party voting in select committees based on different compositions based on the particular function that the select committee is engaged in, cast by a senior MP. Not sure quite on the practicalities, but I think that's one way to try and get a pragmatic way through it.
But I think the practicalities are serious because there's 12 select committees. We struggle to get enough people to fill them all. The proportion of select committees is proportionate to Parliament by and large, with a number being balanced select committees, half opposition, half government. So I just think that that's a great idea. We're all for the select committees having greater, ability to do things. What I would worry about that situation would be that you could end up with bills being returned to the House unaltered because of the inability to get a vote one way or the other. And that, because at the moment there are some select committees where it takes opposition votes to get it back into Parliament. And I think we've just got to be careful that we don't actually end up with a process that totally disrespects any submissions to a bill at all.
And I think I'm trying to address that by saying I think the way to do it is the weightings, rather than being reflected just in the personnel who are on the committee, are actually carried by them as a card, and for legislative matters, the ordinary proportions of the House would apply to avoid that situation of stonewalling and those sorts of things. But when it relates to scrutiny, you've got a different composition because it's slightly different. I mean, I'm happy just to.
Oh no, so we'll certainly have a look at that.
Can I just close on the last point, if I may, which is the use of the select committee time for submissions on bills. I have a quibble as an academic and a more general suggestion, because the formal practice has developed that if you're an individual submitter, you get 5 minutes. You're an organisation one, you get 10 minutes. I think the language is actually it's 5 minutes of a personal submission. The difficulty is for academics from knowledge institutions, we fall between the two, because when I make a submission, I don't make a submission personally. I make a submission in the course of my employment as part of the university's critic and conscience function. But because of academic freedom, the views that I express are my own and not of my employer or my colleagues. So practically what that means is when we make our submissions, like this one here, I've submitted as Dr. Dean Knight, but it really should be Dr. Dean Knight of Victoria University, Wellington. And what that means, the cost of that is, that means that academics have only been getting 5 minutes on some bills, when organisations get 10 minutes. It's been suggested to me, people just invent an organisation. I'm not prepared to go there because I think we'd take seriously the role that academics and those from knowledge institutions may provide to that. And I say that as knowledge institution universities have a statutory mandate to be critic and conscience of society. So we're actually designed to feed into process like that. And I don't want to privilege our particular views over others, but I think
Dr. Knight, we're very aware of this problem.
Yeah.
And it's one that's grown over a number of parliaments. And one of the problems is the volume of submissions that you now get, and the inability in our standing orders to do the sort of triage work that we should do to make sure that there is those who have expertise that are valuable can be heard a bit more. Kieran.
Thank you, Dr. Knight. I enjoyed your submission a lot. Anyone that followed your commentary will not be surprised at the content of it. But nevertheless, it's valuable because of the practical solutions that it puts forward. And there are a number that we've had that come through along those ilk. And the reason that's important, of course, is many of us can agree on the problem. How we then move beyond that in the current circumstances is the challenge. So thank you for that. I just wondered if you might be able to provide commentary or perhaps a potential solution to the issue that's arisen recently, which is relevant to both your comments on urgency and select committee, in that Standing Order 198 allowing for a select committee chair to call for and propose a deadline for submissions, essentially resulting in an earlier report back to the House without an instruction from the House. and how we might be able to look to prevent that happening, or at least clarify what cannot be done.
I'm not sure I want to be drawn yet on that one where it sits, but I do recognise that that is expedition of the lawmaking process, which is generally undesirable. Good things take time, and sometimes things need to be speeded up with good reason, but it shouldn't be sped up for trifling reasons and situations where there is increased cost. And I think where there are situations where whether it's urgency that circumvents select committees, or whether it's a situation where select committees can't do their work, or probably as important, submitters don't have the bandwidth and the ability to be able to make meaningful submissions and constructive submissions. A number of times I've been invited to make a select committee submission, on very short order notice. We're in the midst of marking over 350 exams at the moment in universities. We're a bit quiet because there's a lot on. It actually takes a little bit of ability to be able to prepare a proper and meaningful submission. So anything that takes away from that robustness, that depth of the value of deliberation in committee, in conversation with the community, I worry about.
Thank you. I don't ask that for political reasons. It's literally been identified as a loophole in standing orders, and we have an opportunity now this term to address that. So even your thoughts on that is useful.
Well, yeah, and I'd say fix it.
Yeah.
And because it's not just urgency, there are other means, and that's why I use the language expedition.
Yeah. Thank you.
I don't want to, is it a really important question?
Well, I think it is. You referred to the committees getting sidetracked by things, and other submitters have talked about it before. So are you referring to the theatre that's sort of showing its way through the select committees at the moment when you talk about the sidetrack, that stopping the committees from doing their business, or other things?
I'm a realist. These committees sit in a political environment. I love watching select committees when they're fiery, when they're political. I know that you're sitting there and taking heat if you're a government member for initiative. I think that's part of the politics. I think it's part of our political constitution. But the question is maintaining the balance and the proportionality between that theatre. Theatre has a role as a check and as an expression of the degree of sentiment in the community. I think it's right that you sit through some of that. We want to maintain that, because I don't want to say it's all about constructive, sort of academic submissions on technical stuff as well. That's important. I should add that the point I didn't drop in that last point is, I think there's one thing the committee might think about is whether academic submissions that are similar in character may be there may be caucused together. There's talk of hot tubbing, or something like that, where there's an hour where half a dozen academics come together, and you actually do that deep dive into that sort of group of people. That would be more meaningful to me, even if I had less than 5 minutes to say, because Professor Geddes was doing all the heavy lifting. But you could get more out of the system if you're a little bit more tailored in working out what's going to be the best contribution to our scrutiny of the measure. But I also don't want to give away that I think theatre has a civilising effect.
Your suggestion is actually possible now. It's not being applied.
Yeah.
But